The Scottish National Party's Alex Salmond says former British Prime Minister Tony Blair should be taken to the International Criminal Court for invading Iraq if an inquiry reveals that the former Prime Minister made a secret commitment to the US to support the war. Mr. Salmond has been rallying support to impeach Blair, pending the publication of the Chilcot inquiry into the UK's involvement in the 2003 invasion. Mr. Salmond is leading a cross-party group of MPs to have Mr. Blair impeached. He says, "We are talking about 179 dead British service people, thousands of Americans, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis." Blair told British MPs, however, that intelligence showed Saddam Hussein had active, growing, and up and running weapons of mass destruction. Yet a US report said Saddam destroyed these long ago and had no capacity to build new ones. The Chilcot inquiry was launched in 2009 to investigate the Iraq invasion by the US and the UK and its aftermath. Have Mr. Blair's policies left the Middle East in chaos? When did the Iraq strategy become a disaster? And what should happen to Tony Blair? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, the United Kingdom's invasion of Iraq in 2003 has led to the deaths of many hundreds of thousands of innocent people. We found out how the public felt about this.
Well, it's the story of the Middle East to date, to be honest. So, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people have died now. Iraq, Syria, Egypt as well, and it's just political instability wherever you see. I mean, part of the policy started a long time ago, but I think the sort of intervention in Iraq is most notably probably where you can pinpoint and say, yep, the intervention, along with millions of people who actually on our land in the UK here protesting against it, the government decided to go ahead along with the Allied forces and make a mess of the country it is today.
I would say the civilian casualties are the biggest problem I have. Ultimately, Iraq's in a worse position now than it was when they took decisions that I don't think were all bad, but essentially the outcome is a lot worse than before.
I think it could have been better justified. I think there could have been a bit more time taken on exactly finding out all the facts, really. That's really where I think most people feel most aggrieved. I think there was over 1 million people that actually marched in protest for it, and I don't feel that that voice was really heard in any way.
I think it's a disgrace, to be honest. I think it's something that England as a country should be embarrassed about, and I think it's something that if I went back in time and if I'd been politically stable and active at that point, I would have really made a difference to try and be a part of stopping that, because I just think it's something that England will forever regret, to be honest, as a country.
What is our experts' view about the UK's invasion of Iraq, which left so many hundreds of thousands of innocent people dead?
What do I feel about the war in Iraq and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people that have ensued? I feel this is a massive war crime, a terrible crime against humanity. It was preceded, of course, by a sanctions regime which led to the deaths of many more hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, the most vulnerable, the young, the old, the disabled people, and the ill. And then this was followed up by a war which itself killed many, and where the killing is still going on. This is a terrible crime against humanity, and those who are responsible have never been brought to book, but they must be.
When I'm asked how I feel about the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, I feel absolutely outraged. This wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a disaster that people stumbled into without knowing. It was a deliberate policy by the British government and the American governments and all the other governments that supported them. They were determined to ignore public opinion. They were determined to ignore the weapons inspectors. They were determined to ignore everybody on the ground. And they told us that it would be very quickly successful. The opposite has been the case. So I feel that they have taken the lives of many people unnecessarily. I feel they've ruined the country of Iraq, and I feel that they've ignored democracy in this country and in all other countries where a clear majority of people did not want this war.
The SNP's Alex Salmond says the invasion set off a sequence of events that has left the Middle East in chaos and much of the world suffering from the consequences, the endgame of which is Daesh. We wondered if the public agreed with this analysis.
Well, I would have to know a bit more about the situation in the Middle East. I just think that it's very easy for people in this country, without knowing the culture and how people are going to suffer out there, it's very hard to take a view that's realistic for the people who live there.
Of course, it's a direct legacy to that, but I don't think that it's something where the Houses of Parliament really kind of held the strings. I do think that it was in the interest of bigger companies. Oil is the most common kind of business that people bat around, saying that it was because of them, and it probably was.
Yeah, I think it is. We went in there all guns blazing with the Americans, and then didn't have a plan to restructure, rebuild the society, and it's left a power vacuum at the top of Iraqi government society, which we haven't yet resolved, and that's allowed ISIL to flourish, I think. And we became easy targets because we bombed, and then they could use that in their propaganda material, and then we left without a meaningful, lasting plan. Yeah, it was a bit of a disaster all round.
I believe that the war in Iraq, or the two wars in Iraq, were definitely large contributory factors to the rise of ISIS, and yes.
Do our experts agree with Alex Salmond's analysis of the chaotic and militant outcome from the Iraqi invasion?
What has happened since the war on Iraq is that Iraq itself has been involved in a civil war, an ongoing civil war between different groups, Sunni, Kurd and Shia, and various people trying to exploit those, if you like, religious and cultural and regional and national differences. A terrible civil war. It has spread, of course, to other countries, in particular to Syria, which has now been devastated and has terrible loss of life. It's an unstable situation. Everybody knows that it's a very unstable situation. And there are various other countries involved, like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, all stirring it up. The Americans are in with the mix. And of course, it isn't just that part of the Middle East that has been affected. We've had terrible devastation and chaos now in Libya as a consequence of Western intervention. So anybody who denies that that chaos has ensued, but perhaps even more importantly, anybody who denies that Daesh, that ISIS as it's sometimes called, is a product of that war back in 2003, is also willfully blind. They're trying to evade the Western responsibility, the responsibility of the war on the creation of Daesh.
When you look at the consequences of the war in Iraq, one of the inescapable consequences is the growth of terrorism as a result of the occupation and invasion. If you look where ISIS came from, it came from Iraq. It came actually from a prison. It was formed in a prison in then British-controlled Iraq. So there is a clear line. Eliza Manningham Buller, who was the head of MI5 at the time, told Chilcot that she warned the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, that there would be a big increase in terrorism if we went to war with Iraq. And unfortunately, we're here now, 13 years on from that war and occupation, and she was absolutely right. And the rest of us who said that it was true were absolutely right. So I very much agree with Alex Salmond's point that you can see a line which goes from this invasion to the creation of IS, the dominance of IS, not just in Iraq, but in Syria and now in Libya as well. They're also, they now have a presence in Afghanistan, which was the first country that was invaded under the war on terror. So I think that it's very, very clear that terrorism has grown as a result of the war on terror, and that was exactly the opposite point of what it was meant to do, and therefore at that level it has to be seen as a complete failure.
Tony Blair invaded Iraq under the pretext of finding weapons of mass destruction, but those weapons were never found. If your family had perished in the invasion, what would you want to happen to Blair? That's what we asked the public.
I don't know, like, he should apologise. I don't think he's even apologised for it properly, and he should go to jail, I think, in the end, because at the end you've violated country sovereignty and you haven't done it for, I mean, like a proper reason. You haven't looked at the evidence properly, and it's just something that he's done like really rash, and he could have actually like examined the evidence more clearly and not just took advice from the Americans and just done what the Americans were doing.
Just a fair trial, just a collection of evidence, an evidence-based approach to get him, well, to get him to see what he did was wrong, but also to make sure that justice is done, essentially.
Well, I think that can only be by the people who lost loved ones. I don't think, unless you've, actually experienced the situation, because many, of course, will have lost people who perhaps were their breadwinners and things like that, so they're going to take a much different view than somebody like me over here that's hardly been affected by any of it. So I think that would be a very hard one to...
Well, I mean, like, to me, Tony Blair is a war criminal, but then he's also the face at the front of a lot of people who, and industries who are, obscene.
What would our experts consider an appropriate treatment of Tony Blair in the context of the deaths of so many civilians, so many friends and families?
If I had lost in the war in Iraq, or in events that followed the war in Iraq, if I had lost my mother and father, my wife, my sons and my daughters, I would first of all feel the most incredible sense of injustice, that they died for nothing and they died because of a lie. And I would be obviously grief-stricken, still grief-stricken by those losses, and I don't think it's possible to imagine the pain amongst not just hundreds of thousands but millions of Iraqis over what has happened in 2003 and since. But I would feel a frustration. I would feel a frustration that those who are responsible, it's not just Blair, but Blair is very important. It's also George W. Bush, it's Dick Cheney, it's Donald Rumsfeld. It's many people alongside Blair in his cabinet, all of whom have a responsibility for what have happened. None of them have been brought to account. None of them have been held responsible for what they did, this massive war crime.
Tony Blair was the person as keen as anybody in the world, as keen as George Bush, as keen as any of the other world leaders in wanting to go to war. I think now he should face prosecution if, as we expect, Chilcot shows that he did make a deal with George Bush a year before the war, and we were told this hadn't happened, but it clearly did happen when he went to Crawford, Texas, that they decided to go to war and then they fitted the facts to their conclusion rather than the other way round. Now, I think if that is shown to be the case, that he should expect to face prosecution. He should go to The Hague. I think that is what we would expect from anybody who'd done this. And the truth of the matter is that the War Crimes Court seems to be reserved for dictators from less powerful countries, and while there may be no problem for lots of people with that being the case, it does seem to me that the biggest country should also face this sanction if it is clear that they have broken international law over taking us to war.
Mr. Blair and his supporters have been condemned from the run-up to the war for failing to find weapons of mass destruction, destroying Iraq and creating ISIL. At what point did the public know the Iraq war would be a disaster?
Well, I mean, from the onset, I think 1 million people protesting against the war. It was a mistake in itself because there wasn't any credible evidence to suggest that there are sort of weapons of mass destruction or, you know, any sort of strategy to say, right, here's what we're doing or where we're going in. Even with, for example, more recently with Libya, the idea was that we'd get rid of Gaddafi and, you know, Libya will be sort of back on its toes and, you know, business as usual. But it's obvious that Libya in itself is a mess, and there just hasn't been any lessons learned whatsoever, and it was a mistake from the onset.
I thought from the beginning, I never thought we should have gone in. I think if you can't directly show the future in quite an obvious way, I think it's too much, you're playing with too many people's lives in order to make that decision. So you need to be, that's why not going into Syria is the same for me. If you can't determine the future in a clear way, then ultimately the actions you're taking are not built on solid ground.
Oh gosh, that I can't answer. I think personally, again, I was young when it all started, but I think from the beginning to the end it was a wrong thing to do, it was a mistake, and it was something that it should be reversed if it could go back.
I was quite young when it was happening actually, so it was more like the aftermath and all of the anger that surrounded it that made me aware of it, because I was probably like 12 when it was happening.
When did our experts realise that Mr. Blair's military strategy towards Iraq would be catastrophically unsuccessful?
Well, I think that there were very many of us in the anti-war movement. Remember that 2 million people marched on the streets of London prior to the war being launched. There were many of us who knew that this would be a terrible disaster. We knew it for not just for months, but for years prior to the war taking place, that any such intervention would be a disaster. In fact, even the governments of the West at one point realised what a disaster it would be. If you remember, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, apparently because he thought he'd got a green light to do so by his allies at that time, the Americans, they then launched a war against this to boot him out of Kuwait. This couldn't be allowed to stand. The Israelis were against it. The Saudis were threatened by it, apparently. The West was threatened by it. So they booted him out. But they didn't get rid of him. They got him out of Kuwait, but they stopped short. They left him in place, albeit under a sanctions regime which caused terrible destruction to life and property in the country. But they realised the disaster that would occur if they were simply to remove Saddam Hussein and leave chaos in the wake, the disaster that we've had since 2003. So at some point this changed, but we knew what kind of a disaster a Western intervention, designed not to stop WMD, that was always a lie. It was designed to bring about regime change, which of course is against the United Nations Charter.
I knew right from long before the war started that it would be a disaster. Now, I have to say perfectly honestly, I didn't realise it would be as big a disaster as it has turned out to be. But it was absolutely obvious that whatever you thought about Saddam, whatever the arguments of many Iraqi people against him, it would not, the problems of the Iraqis, the problems of democracy, the problems of freedom, all the problems that people obviously strive for in those countries would not be solved by going to war.
Politician Alex Salmond says that Tony Blair should be taken to the International Criminal Court if the Chilcot inquiry reveals he made a secret commitment to Washington to support the war. Do the public agree, and why?
Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah, that would make sense, because it would become an international issue, and that's where he should be tried. Yeah.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, because he's the guy at the top, and whatever the situation, he made that final decision, and therefore he has to carry the can for it.
I do, but we've got to stop looking beyond individuals and understand that there are much bigger players whom I don't know that are behind him. He's just the face. He's just the face of it, and I think nothing gets better until you acknowledge that.
I suppose, yeah, we hold African dictators to account. And if they've committed, we've had lots of the Yugoslavian people. I suppose I would be fearful it would become a bit of a show trial, a bit of a media circus. But yeah, if there's a legal case to answer, I don't think anyone should be immune from answering what they've done wrong.
I think there'd definitely be a position for that. But do I think that'll ever happen? I'm doubtful. You know, I mean, these people protect each other. They destroy any paper trails. You know, they're very good at obfuscating, and they're not above telling out-and-out lies. You know, so do I think he'll be called to account? We can all call him a liar. We can all call him names and stuff. But will anything actually happen that would seriously redress it? Or I have to say I don't think so.
Do our experts believe Mr. Blair should face the International Criminal Court if he made a secret pact with America to back the war?
I do agree with Alex Salmond, but I wouldn't make it as conditional as he has on what the Chilcot report actually says. We've had to wait 7 years for this report, which is ridiculous. It's been constantly delayed. They've given every chance for those who feel that they might be in the frame to argue against what others have said, to dispute the evidence and so on and so forth. Even now, it's going to be delayed until after the European Union referendum, needlessly so, but because they fear that there may be political consequences from the report. And we have a history of the establishment appointing its own when there's a problem, to conduct a report, to examine the facts, and then to exonerate anybody that you thought might have been responsible for crimes that might have been committed. So I'm not holding my breath. I hope that the Chilcot inquiry, the Chilcot report, does clearly identify Tony Blair's role in this war crime, the war on Iraq. But I think the evidence is already there for us to see. It doesn't actually need the Chilcot inquiry to tell us this.
Alex Salmond has made the point that if Tony Blair did a deal, he should go to The Hague and he should be put on trial. I absolutely agree with this. I think there are many arguments against wars, against any wars, not always legal ones. Sometimes wars can be legal and, in my opinion, can still be wrong, but are justified in terms of international legal agreements. I think in this case it was absolutely clear that there was a decision to go to war, whether it was legal or not. And one of the things that I think Chilcot will show was that there was a massive disagreement among legal officers around the government, among figures in the government themselves, as to whether it was legal or not. Now that, at the very least, should have made Tony Blair stop and think about it. The fact that it didn't, we're all still living with the consequences. And unlike Tony Blair, most of us aren't multimillionaires who just swan around the world speaking to conferences of people who already agree with him. They're people who suffer the consequences. The Iraqis suffer the consequences. The other people of the Middle East are suffering the consequences of terrorism. And we here in Britain are still suffering. And in France and many other countries, we're suffering the consequences of a war on terror, which has been a complete disaster in every way that you look at it.
Tony Blair's decision to invade Iraq triggered a series of events that has left the Middle East in chaos and caused much of the world suffering from the consequences. His military strategy also provoked the creation and growth of Daesh. Hardly surprising then that many accused Tony Blair of war crimes. The Chilcot inquiry has yet to report. Depending what it says, Tony Blair may yet have to face his day in the International Criminal Court.